Welcome to this evening's debate as part of the International Summer Schools 2014. Tonight we are going to be discussing the topic of geoengineering. And the question is it time to think about engineering the climate? Now, in front of you, you have a short paragraph from Martin Rees, who was President of the Royal Society until recently. The continuing rise in atmospheric concentration of greenhouse gases, mainly caused by the burning of fossil fuels, is driving changes in the Earth's climate. The long-term consequences will be exceedingly threatening, especially if nations continue business as usual in the coming decades. Most nations now recognise the need to shift to low-carbon economy, and nothing should divert us from the main priority of reducing global greenhouse gas emissions. But if such reductions achieve too little too late, there will be surely pressure to consider a plan B to seek ways to counteract the climatic effects of greenhouse gas emissions by geoengineering. And here geoengineering is defined as the deliberate, large-scale manipulation of the Earth's environment in an attempt to counteract the effects of anthropogenic climate change. Now, there are two main strands of geoengineering. One is solar radiation management, which is SRM. There's always a three-letter acronym. And solar radiation management is about reducing the amount of solar radiation that reaches the Earth. If we can reduce the amount of solar radiation by 2%, we will cause some global cooling to counteract global warming. But of course that leaves carbon dioxide in the atmosphere and acidification of the oceans and so on. Carbon dioxide removal is the second main strand of geoengineering, and that involves, and it's CDR, by the way, is its TLA, and carbon dioxide removal means that technologies to remove the CO2 that we have over the past couple of centuries put there. Now we have four speakers tonight. Speaking for the motion, we have Oliver Morton and Peter Wadhams. And speaking against the motion, we have Helena Paul and Matt Watson. My name's Hugh Hunt, and we are going to kick off this evening with Peter Wadhams.
Thank you. Now, the reason I'm for the motion is that I think we really have no choice except to seriously consider the use of geoengineering to cover the period that's upon us quite soon, or is already upon us, whereby the rate of global warming due to carbon dioxide and methane being put into the atmosphere by man is becoming so rapid that it threatens to run away with itself or to run away with us. So, in other words, some famous person said, what's the choice? Not a famous phrase, but anyway. And the reason is that the carbon dioxide that we put into the atmosphere, which has now exceeded 400 parts per million, is sufficient, if you don't add any more, to actually raise global temperatures in the end by about 4 degrees. And we've got the politicians, as an excuse for doing nothing really, came up with this idea that 2 degrees of warming is what we can tolerate before things get rather bad. And they based that 2 degrees on some of the earlier work by the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, and it implied that we could still produce and emit quite a lot of CO2 before we've emitted enough to give us 2 degrees of warming. But more recent work on the climate sensitivity of the planet to CO2 suggests, and because CO2 itself is so long-lived in the atmosphere, it's hundreds of years it has an influence. This suggests that the warming will actually has already reached 2 degrees. I mean, use a higher value for climate sensitivity, then we conclude that, in fact, this 2-degree limit was reached in the 1960s. So that the amount of CO2 we put in the atmosphere by then, if we stopped emitting and just let the climate gradually warm, it would warm by 2 degrees. So we haven't got any carbon left to spend. We haven't got a budget anymore. We passed that budget some decades ago. So everything we emit now is taking us beyond that. And as we know, carbon dioxide is very long-lived in the atmosphere. It's a ratchet effect. We put it into the atmosphere quite happily, immediately, instantly, by burning fossil fuels. But it takes several hundred years for a molecule of carbon dioxide to work its way out of the Earth, atmosphere, ocean, biological system, and into somewhere where it's not doing any more damage, like the bottom of the ocean. So we can't get back to a climate that's not rapidly warming unless we don't just have to reduce our carbon emissions, we actually have to stop them, and we don't even just have to stop them, we have to start taking carbon out of the atmosphere. So while we get around to doing that, and we're getting around to it very, very slowly, because at the moment there's no sign even of a reduction of the rate of increase of carbon dioxide emissions. It's still going up exponentially. There's no sign that it's decreasing, whatever politicians say. And it's going to be very difficult to reduce it anyway, because the way that fossil fuel is built into the structure of our society, the structure of our cities. I mean, what do you do with Los Angeles if you can't burn fossil fuels to get about? What do you do with the shopping centres around Cambridge? So we can't easily reduce our carbon emissions, and we're not even trying at the moment. And even if we did, it wouldn't be enough. We've already got too much carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. So ultimately, we have to find ways to take carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere. And this is not strictly geoengineering, it's another set of measures that will be needed in the long run. Techniques like putting sodium hydroxide trees, which are where you expose sodium hydroxide to the atmosphere and take carbon dioxide out. Olivine rocks, which react with carbon dioxide, you can spread them around everywhere. Very, very expensive methods, and really we don't have a method that isn't possibly expensive yet. So lots of research is needed on taking carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere. That's a long way ahead, but we have to do it. So in the meantime, there's a gap. There's a period where we can't tolerate the rate of warming that carbon dioxide is giving us. But we have to try to reduce that rate of warming because of the way it's leading to disappearance of Arctic sea ice, disappearance of the Greenland ice sheet, all those knock-on feedback effects which are multiplying the impact of global warming. So if we can apply a sticking plaster during that period when we gradually get around to finding ways to reduce emissions and take carbon out of the atmosphere, we have to do it, or we have to really try to do it. And that's where geoengineering techniques, the ones that Hugh Hunt has described, can come in, and can come in quite cheaply in relation to, say, military budgets. And they will work, although the dangers, of course, which I think colleagues here are going to talk about, are that what it will do to the atmosphere in reducing the rate of warming, or actually knocking back warming into a cooling, could have dangers and impacts which we don't understand. So the case against, which I shouldn't make, but I know what case for, is we've already messed up the Earth by technology, so if we apply more technology, we're going to mess it up worse. So that's the sort of pessimistic view of mankind with technology, which is possibly justified. But we have to try, I think, and we have to try methods that are as benign as possible. For instance, marine cloud brightening, which uses only water, as opposed to methods that use sulfur dioxide or possibly other toxic materials released into the stratosphere. But at least we have to try something. And, or more benign methods like some kind of targeted afforestation. But we can't do nothing, and this is why I believe that we have to really now focus on methods that we can apply to actually achieve some kind of delay in the warming. It won't save us from things like ocean acidification, effects which are purely due to CO2, like the absorption of CO2 by the ocean and what that does to the structure of the ocean, and possibly absorption of heat by the ocean acidification, which is going on apace and is causing loss of corals and is causing also possibly loss of marine life from killing off shellfish. But it won't do anything about those things, but it will slow down, and it certainly would slow down or stop, if you apply enough of it, global warming for as long as you keep applying it. And what we have to do is to investigate what will be the likely impacts, the likely side effects, and then I believe we should be going ahead and trying to start trials on methods that we could use. Because the ultimate being an insurance policy against an unexpected horror, and the unexpected horror that I expect as a possibility is a sudden burst of methane from the Arctic seabed, which is being studied at the moment. It's already, something like it is already happening, but it could happen to a much greater extent, and it's been foreseen that maybe 50 gigatons of methane could be released in 10 years, which will give in itself a 0.6 degree warming of the global climate within a few years. That would be a disastrous change, and is due to the fact that the seabed, with the sea ice retreating from the Arctic, is warming up and releasing this methane. If that happens, and we've sort of forecast that it will and calculated the cost, which will be stratospheric, then we need to have something in our back pocket that we can try to apply to reduce the warming that's doing this. So we either have to do that in the way of new techniques, or a special technique just for methane, like a sort of fracking where you drill in under the methane and release it. So we need that as an insurance policy against the kind of catastrophic effect that might happen. So I think we need, therefore, to consider geoengineering techniques.
Thank you. So, Matt, Helena, have you a question?
My question to you is one that I wanted to ask a person who makes these kind of prognostications many times, and that is, here we have a room full of people whose lives are ahead of them. What are they supposed to do, and how are they supposed to respond to this? Because it feels very top-down.
Yes, but it's not really top-down. It's because they're the ones who are going to have to live through this. And I think initially it is, because the methods that are going to be used, or need to be used if you're going to do geoengineering, are very expensive. But I said they're cheap. That means they're cheap in relation to military budgets. They're cheap in relation to what it would cost to take carbon out of the atmosphere, which at the moment is about $300 a tonne, which is a completely outrageous figure. We can't afford to do it. So lots of very expensive research will be needed on removing carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. But even doing the geoengineering, because it's a global effect, it will need to be done on an international basis with some international body regulating it. So inevitably you're dealing with governments. So the impact of normal human beings must be to influence our governments to do the things that are needed, instead of just doing nothing, which is what they're doing at the moment, to do what's needed to be able to handle this problem and save us from some really terrible consequences if we have runaway global warming.
Matt, question from you?
My understanding of the current literature is that if we stopped pumping CO2 into the atmosphere tomorrow, we would stay under 2 degrees. I'm not an expert in this, but that's where most of my climate modelling friends tell me we are. It's obvious we're not going to do that, so that's a bit of a corollary. But could you address the question of preempting in some sort of mode of despair a catastrophe that we might avoid? So I think it's absolutely clear that we're going to hit a climate catastrophe soon, and this debate becomes rather fraught. But actually, I think the conventional wisdom is we still have time to sort ourselves out.
Well, that's yes, I mean, that's the view I would challenge, that we still have time. I think we have to do something straight away. And one that could hit it immediately, which is the one I mentioned, and is being seen to be happening now by the annual expeditions to the Arctic, is the emission of methane from the seabed, which promises, I mean, there's massive amounts of methane there, 1,500 gigatons, of which we're assuming about 50 will come out, but there's equally large amounts of methane being generated by melting permafrost on land. And that will happen. The offshore might not, it might still hang on in there, but on land, the permafrost is melting, and the total amount of methane that is to be released is very, very large. So that's something that will happen, and that we have to try to find a way to deal with. We can deal with the offshore methane if we spend a lot of money on drilling these fracking-type wells underneath the sediments, which would please the oil industry because they do that for us, and of course remove the methane in the process and sell it. But they would be serving mankind for once. But permafrost on land, you can't do anything about it stopping that emission, and that's where you need to have something that will hold back the warming that's caused it.
We have time for a question from the floor.
Yes.
So the question is that we're a bit puzzled that we're already 2 degrees warmer. Are we already 2 degrees?
We're just under 1 degree warmer than pre-industrial levels at the moment, but the amount of carbon that's in the atmosphere now will mean that if we stop any more emissions and just sit there, the climate will keep warming because it takes decades for the carbon to work its way through the system and produce a fully realised warming from the amount, from the transient warming that you get in.
So you're saying even if no more carbon dioxide is emitted, the temperature will still go up?
Yes, if we suddenly went back to Stone Age and didn't emit any more carbon dioxide, then in about 100 years' time, we'd have 2 degrees of warming. The temperature will keep going up. So that's why it's false for the politicians to say we're keeping the warming below 2. We can keep it below 2 degrees of realised warming, but ultimately we'll go past that as well.
Another question here?
The business of the Arctic warming, it seems to be warming very much faster than the IPCC have reckoned, and the exponential curve indicates that the sea ice might disappear in a couple of years at the end of summer. So how are we going to stop that? Is there any natural mechanism that's going to stop this happening?
Well, I don't think there is, and I can think of. I mean, I've forecast that summer sea ice will disappear in a year or two's time, and so I think that it will. And this summer it will stay about the same as last year, but next year, with an El Nino, it will go down, and probably disappear in a year or two. But it will be gone. The summer sea ice will be gone soon, and then the ice-free season will grow to 2, 3, 4 months. And I don't see a way. The only way, again, is if we apply geoengineering kind of relentlessly, and if our initial research shows that you can target it regionally, that you can target the Arctic by one of the techniques like marine cloud brightening, then that would be great, because that would be a way of bringing back the sea ice, and bringing back the sea ice will reduce the methane emissions. but I suspect all our geoengineering techniques will tend to have global effects rather than regional effects.
Well, thank you very much, Peter. And I now call to the floor Matt Watson, who will speak against the motion.
Firstly, thank you very much, Hugh, for inviting me. It's a pleasure to be here to talk to so many bright young things and the grown-ups as well. I would describe myself as a recovering geoengineer. I have been doing some thinking about geoengineering, and it's proved actually rather difficult. I'm going to probably speak a little bit more to Peter than I am to Ollie, not least because I read a recent survey that said there's sort of 82% trust in environmental scientists and 14% trust in journalists. So I'm sort of expecting you to buy into Peter a little more knowledge. Sorry, we didn't promise no ad-hominem attacks, but I couldn't resist that one. So I know I'm dead meat later. I've recently read a book by Mike Hume, which actually poses 3 arguments against geoengineering. Before I start discussing those 3, I'd like to make a slightly subtle distinction between CDR and SRM. So a lot of what people describe as CDR, I don't think should be called geoengineering. So if you are replanting trees, or if you're doing this thing called BECCS, which is bioenergy, carbon capture and storage, I don't think that's geoengineering, I think that's actually prudence. In terms of CDR, the only technique that I would think of as geoengineering in a classical sense is ocean fertilization. So when I'm talking about geoengineering, I'm talking about large planetary scale manipulations, and those, quite frankly, are terrifying. Mike Hume goes on to pose 3 arguments, and I'll go through them in detail. The first is that the science is unreliable, the second is that the process is ungovernable, and the third is that it's undesirable. I'm going to do my opposition of favour and take out 2 of those arguments immediately because they're clearly nonsense. Mike Hume has a quite significant go at scientists described as hubristic and arrogant. There's very few people around the table who think geoengineering is exciting or safe. It really is perceived to be by absolutely everybody as a desperate last resort. I think the danger about saying something's undesirable is that he falls into a trap that a lot of people that are talking against geoengineering fall into, which is a lack of adequate counterfactual. What I mean by that is he says something along the lines of, well, actually the planet's not too bad at the moment, why do we need to do this? That's not what he says explicitly, but that's what the subtext of his discussion is. That's a really stupid idea. If you want a very good idea about how geoengineering will work, compare it to what the planet looks like in 50 years' time, not today. However, the one argument that he actually got right but completely underplayed is the unreliability. And this speaks to risk and uncertainty in the climate system. I'm going to make 2 arguments. One of them is going to be quite positive. In fact, I'm going to leave the majority of that argument up to Helena. And that is that we know what the right answer is, right? And it's not geoengineering. It's not CDR, and it's certainly not SRM. The right answer is to live sustainably, have a low carbon energy system, and behave ourselves and have some profound respect for the environment. Helena's going to speak to this in more detail, but it's actually perfectly simple. That's the right thing to do. There's no question about it whatsoever. Given that we're absolutely stupid and can't do that, let me make 2 further points about risk and uncertainty. The first is that the system is far too complex to be predictable. Our climate models don't do particularly good at predicting all of the things we need to worry about in terms of climate change, such as rainfall, sea ice. Everything that we need to know about is poorly captured in climate models. There's a lot of, and I apologise to the climate models in the room, but I do passionately agree with this, there's a lot of genealogy in these models, which means they are actually rather similar, which means actually the uncertainty space of these models explores rather narrow, artificially narrow. That doesn't mean that they're wrong, but it means that they are uncertain. That's an argument, you could say, for not doing geoengineering now. Okay? That's not the motion. The motion is not to think about geoengineering ever. Okay? The problem with thinking about geoengineering is it's quite likely, highly likely, some people believe, to lead to deployment. We're appallingly bad as a species at developing technologies we then don't use. If anybody can think of a large-scale technology that we've deployed and then kept in our pockets, you're a better person than I am. There is an artificial distinction between deployment and research. Okay, people say just do research and then we'll think about deployment later. That's a fallacy of an argument because there is no bright line between the two. If you want to know how this stuff really works on a global scale, you would have to do it on a global scale. And even David Keith's idea about ramping up until you see things start to go pear-shaped is a very dangerous idea because that is not deployment. That is experimentation on the planet. There's the question of who has control and the likelihood of geopolitical conflict. These are underplayed worries about going down the route of geoengineering. And the problem with thinking about geoengineering now is that actually the downstream consequences are very uncertain. But there's a very clear, slippery slope towards actually getting to the point where we can justify this. And it is absolutely terrifying as a prospect. I raised the point of some research done under the SPICE project, which shows that if you cool the top half of the planet, the northern hemisphere, you end up protecting sea ice, which, don't get me wrong, is a good idea and a noble thing to attempt. Unfortunately, what then subsequently happens is if you turn off rainfall in sub-Saharan Africa, okay? There are teleconnections that we don't understand and can't model. That means that this stuff is so uncertain that the risks of doing it vastly outweigh any potential benefits. Unfortunately, attempting geoengineering is likely to engender and strengthen the status quo. I'll give you a slightly odd analogy here, which is my car is due for an MOT. And about you, I've got a reasonably new car, but not very new, otherwise it wouldn't need an MOT. But I'm being hounded and spammed by the people that sold me the car that I need for an MOT. I've had 4 texts and 5 emails in 7 days, and it's not due until next Friday. I will have it done either next Thursday or Friday, right? We are not particularly good as a species, you could argue it's just me, at doing things preemptively and sensibly. We tend to leave things to the last minute. And the terrifying thing about this is if we deploy it badly, it will, I guarantee, be worse than where we're going into climate change. And that is an incredible thing to say. I don't believe people will act if there is an alternative. I'm not suggesting in any way that this alternative is easy, because it isn't. And anybody that says that geoengineering is a cheap and easy out, I don't believe at all. I don't believe it even looks cheap and easy or politically sensible. But I guarantee you the risks are so large at the moment. We have not a cat and mouse chance of doing it properly. And every time we intervene, even in small scale systems, I'll give you an example of mongoose on Hawaii, where they were introduced to kill the rat population that was artificially introduced by sailors in the 15th century, which then decimated the local bird population because they couldn't be bothered to chase the rats around the island as opposed to the nesting birds. Every time we intervene in the system, something goes wrong because it's more complicated than we understand. Unfortunately, this entire issue, as Tim Kruger wrote in a recent report in Nature, is an issue about virtue. Okay? It's how we treat and respect the planet. And unfortunately, geoengineering is an extension of thinking of the planet as a system that can be fixed technologically, and it can't. We simply need to change our behavior.
So we have 2 questions now from...
Matt, I thought that was fascinating. It struck me that everything you say about why geoengineering is bad, you can just change the word geoengineering to climate change. And in doing so, it seems to me your argument is about shutting down people's room for discussion. You say people will only act in the way that you have decided is correct if they're not allowed to think about the alternatives, and thus we should stop them from thinking about the alternatives. That seems to me a difficult argument to put a good face on.
It is an argument, but it's an argument that I stand by. I mean, I think we're going to be in such serious trouble that actually any sort of societal norms might actually go out the window. And although this is not an endorsement of this action in general, I would make the observation that the most totalitarian regimes, particularly places like China, have the authority to plant billions of trees, which is what they've been doing. And I think it might get to the point where it's actually that serious. And I know that's a horrible thing to say, but actually I also can't imagine democracy flourishing under a geoengineering regime either.
You said rightly that in the long run we have to live sustainably and respect the planet. But the problem, which you in fact identified, is that in 1992 there was the first assessment by the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, which predicted or showed that the rate of warming was such as to lead to fairly disastrous consequences, which have all come about because the rate of warming has kept up with that or exceeded it. And we knew then that if we want to live sustainably, to live sustainably is the way not to have massive amounts of global warming. But in 25 years, we've done absolutely nothing. That, as you say, the human race doesn't want to do anything unless it's absolutely forced to, and climate change has been slow enough, or just slow enough, that they haven't had to do anything. You haven't had to stop driving your SUV because you can't get any petrol for it. So, I mean, would you feel that in an ideal world, even an ideal world with 7 billion people that's got to be fed industrially, we could live sustainably? Do you think that we can, because it is a moral issue, because we failed utterly so far, even despite knowing what the consequences would be of not living sustainably?
So I'm going to answer that question quickly in 3 parts. Firstly, I just think we have to try harder, a lot harder. Secondly, yes, I do think we can all live sustainably, but that's going to require massive societal change, which you will argue rightly is not going to be quick. And I think that's a fair and legitimate argument. I think the counterpoint to your point, however, is that if we can't get the right answer right, i.e. we know we need to be living sustainably, we know we need to worry about climate change, I don't see us as having a snowflake in hell's chance of actually then administering the wrong answer in any better way.
Some questions from the floor. There's one up back there. Microphone here, which I can run. Okay.
Thank you. I have probably 2 quick points to make. One is, I think there's a problem between scientists and journalists. Journalists don't understand facts, and they insist on reporting 2 sides of the story. The second point is, there's a problem in the way we do economics. Economic models last for 20 years at the maximum, 30 years at the maximum. Climate models last a lot longer, unless we factor into account the cost of dumping CO2 and using the environment. None of this will ever be sustainable.
I agree with you about, partially about economics. So certainly economic timescales for models are on the order of a few decades. Political timescales are even shorter, of course. It's very difficult to get a politician to think about what's going to happen in 50 years' time. It's a long way outside their tenure. And as Peter absolutely correctly points out, the carbon dioxide we're pumping into the atmosphere now will be around in hundreds of years' time. I do agree that economics has to play a role, but actually economics can be rather cold and rather insensitive. And what I worry about is there's a lot of other value that you can attach to the environment that's not solely economic. So when people start talking about ecosystem services and valuing nature, I see that as a very important tool, but I think it has, from a personal perspective, it has to be only part of the argument. I don't think this can be decided purely on economics. And I think the worry is that if you did that, you'd end up concluding that SRM was the way to go, because it is orders of magnitude cheaper than living sustainably. It simply isn't.
Mike, you said one remarkably precise thing. You said the effect of deploying geoengineering would undoubtedly be worse than the effect of climate change. How do you know? What are the reasons that you believe that?
Well, I guess I'm going to be slightly disingenuous here. It's a very good point, and the truth is I don't know, so I'm going to waffle a little bit. I think the honest truth is you could not tell. Okay, so if we decided to geoengineer 10 years ago, just prior to the devastating floods in Pakistan, that event, because it was something like a 1 in 1,000 year flood, would have been attributed to the start of geoengineering. So you have a problem of unknowability, And you also have a problem of, and there was a very good paper done by Damon Matthews in 2009, who drew these analogues between bio-intervention on a small scale and geoengineering. And what he pointed out is that pretty much any time we try to engineer a system, even a simple system, there are unknown unknowns. So I'll take my precision back slightly, because you're exactly correct as it turns out. This is the problem with doing things on the hoof. And I'll reclassify my statement as you wouldn't be able to tell. But actually there is a significant risk of getting it worse. There's a significant risk of the cure being worse than the disease.
Hi, so this is somewhat related to something that Mr. Morton said earlier. Do you think that geoengineering and changing the way we live are mutually exclusive? Do you think that if we start geoengineering, we'll lose the will to try to live more sustainably?
Yes, so this is an argument called the moral hazard, which states that if you make something easy, then people won't change. I think, not to put my social science colleagues on the spot, I think that's a significant risk, but I don't know the magnitude of the risk. It's quite uncertain. So it could be a small effect, it could be a large effect. I don't think it could be on the realms of possibility that geoengineering, so taking the edge of the temperature of the planet, would encourage people not to change as fast. I think that's quite a likely outcome. I think not least because there are some quite strong arguments about the biosphere that suggest in a geoengineered, hazy, high CO2 world, actually more the biosphere, particularly the artificial parts of the biosphere that we use as crops, might benefit. There are papers, particularly by Ken Caldera's group, that suggest that high SO2 SRM world might be in some ways more palatable. I think that may be true, but actually it's quite a dangerous argument.
Well, thank you very much, Matt.
Hi, thanks very much for inviting me. A slight change of pace now, because unlike our two excellent previous speakers, I'm not a natural scientist. I'm not a scientist of any sort. I'm a writer, and I'm actually writing a book on this stuff, which has led me to think a little bit about it. And so I wanted to share with you a few thoughts about the nature of the motion. And I want to start off by pointing out to you briefly that not thinking about engineering the climate is what is historically odd. The fact that we ask ourselves, is it time to think about engineering the climate, would, throughout most of modern history, have been a strange question, because through most of modern history and through most of the history of climate science, people have thought about that, because people have thought about society and the climate as things which act upon each other and which interact in interesting ways. And so here, for instance, is Buffon, the great natural historian of the 18th century, in his Époque de la Nature. Man is able to modify the influence of the climate that he inhabits, to fix, you might say, the temperature at the level most convenient to him. This is not an odd view for Buffon to have. This is an entirely normal view for men and a few women of the 18th and 19th centuries to believe. They believed mainly, though not always, that by growing and cutting down forests, humans had a large influence on the climate, and that they could use that influence for good. So, I mean, other people and climate is immensely important to these people, to people in the 18th and early 19th century, in a way that it isn't to people in the early 20th century, because they invest a lot of their thought about what sort of person you are in terms of how you interact with the climate, how your civilization interacts with the climate. So climate is a very big topic for them, much more bigger topic in the Enlightenment era that I'm talking about than it was to the early 20th century, where climate was just a bunch of numbers about annual rainfall. And they thought very seriously that they should be involved in modifying the climate. Thomas Jefferson, for example, is very keen on modifying the climate. He's keen on having a Panama Canal cut, so to increase the modifications that he thinks And most educated people, not all, but most educated people of his time and class think that by turning the earth from forest into fields, you improve it. I'm not saying that they were right. I am saying that through most of our modern history, over most of 200, 300 recent years, this is the way we've discussed the world. I talk about Jefferson. If you look at the great climate crisis of the early 19th century when a volcano called Tambora erupted and there was a large but short climate shift all around the world, the response from everyone from people writing editorials in newspapers in Dublin who say we must start moving icebergs around more to deal with this terrible change in the climate, to the French Interior Ministry who say every department must report to us now on its climate modification plans. No one thinks that climate is something that simply needs to be left to itself. There's a particularly strong version of this history in various histories of colonialism, and I should just actually add to this. I can slightly speak to what Matt was saying. I've had the great privilege of going to Ascension Island, an island that had its climate deliberately altered in the 19th century by the creation of forests where it had previously been entirely desert. And of course, there were unintended consequences. The obvious one of, yes, you put cats on the island and they eat all the birds' eggs. But also you see, if you go to Ascension Island, that humans are able to deal with unintended consequences, at least to some extent. There are no longer any feral cats on Ascension because they were removed with extreme prejudice. And there are now seabirds returning to Ascension. And I've seen the fairy terns flying in the forest where there were previously a few ferns, and it's not the worst thing in the world. So, people throughout our recent history think that the right thing to do with the climate is to interact with it, not to simply try and keep it static. And this idea continues. This is not just an idea of Enlightenment philosophy. Is that counting down or up?
Down.
Bugger. Okay, so the first major report on carbon dioxide and the greenhouse effect that went to an American president, which was called Restoring the Quality of Our Environment in 1965, said more or less exactly what Buffon would have said. It said the climatic changes that may be produced by the increased CO2 content could be deleterious from the point of view of human beings. The possibilities of deliberately bringing about countervailing climatic changes therefore need to be thoroughly explored. And that's all I'm arguing for, by the way, thorough exploration. I'm not saying we should rush into geoengineering. I'm saying that geoengineering helps us think more broadly about climate. And I think very specifically, we have seen from 1970 through to about 2000, 30 years, and very particularly in 5 years from 1987 to 1992, we saw the way people talk about climate narrowed down spectacularly from a broad view to a very specific view that carbon dioxide is the problem and must be regulated. I have no problem with the idea that carbon dioxide levels are a big problem and that they need to be dealt with in many different ways. But the idea that you can collapse a very big problem, which as Matt and Peter were pointing out, exists on timescales of centuries to millennia, to what we decided was the most straightforward way of dealing with it between 1987 and 1992. This seems to me to be a totally unnatural and unhelpful hobbling of the imagination. Because if we don't think about geoengineering, that doesn't mean we don't do geoengineering, because geoengineering can take place without a large public discussion. An example would be the fact that in the 20th century, humankind geoengineered the nitrogen cycle in a large way. Humans now fix more nitrogen from the atmosphere than all the bacteria of all the Earth's soils. 40% of the nitrogen in the proteins and DNA in your body comes from a factory that made the fertilizer. This is an extraordinary change in the way the world works. It was done at some levels deliberately, but without large public scale discussion. And if the public had been involved, we might have done it better than we did. So seeing that I'm going to skip over a few things now, we could come back if you like to why I think we very severely narrowed the discussion on climate to a discussion on carbon dioxide in the 1990s. But the other thing to remember I'm calling in general just for a broader discussion, but we must remember that the narrowing down to carbon dioxide not only gets rid of alternatives, it also, to date, has not worked at all. The carbon intensity of electricity generated in the world today is exactly what it was 10 years ago. The carbon intensity of energy throughout the world has in fact increased somewhat since 1990, a period which has also seen more people raised from poverty than any other period in history. And so the idea that we can just reduce carbon dioxide may or may not make sense seen from as far in the future as Buffon is now in our past. But I suspect that we need to think more broadly about our relationship with the climate, about how we adapt to it, about how we attempt to modify it, and how we attempt to stop doing harm to it. It seems to me to say that we're only going to have one or at most two of those discussions is to shortchange the world. Thank you.
So we have questions from Caroline.
I'd be interested to know what kind of scientific research program you might want to start if you were thinking in those kind of terms.
I want to think about. I mean, I'd be interested in a program that would look first of all at how one might monitor changes that one might wish to bring about in geoengineering. But I actually don't want to start a scientific research program at the moment. I do want to see a broader discussion of how and why and in what ways humans are best expected to care about nature and to care about each other. So I don't think that I think there is a tendency to say, oh, let's narrow down on the scientific program immediately. There are interesting scientific research programs, and there are some particularly that you might want to see taken ahead, and I would be interested in finding out what sort of aerosols you can put in the stratosphere without harming the ozone layer. That would be, to me, an interesting question from various points of view. But I'm not saying that this is a thing to be done, in the next 5 years in a rush. I'm saying that a civilization which dominates the processes of an Earth system should think about how it actually manipulates or doesn't manipulate that Earth system. It should not say, I don't know what to do, so I'm going to try and do nothing, because it's fairly clear that doing nothing in terms of omitting nothing is not going to happen. And so you do need some balance between what you think you might like, what you're very afraid of and want to forestall, what you think you can do by changing behaviour. But remember, you have to change the behaviour of people who may not want to change their behaviour. We've had a thriving socialist movement in this country for centuries, and it has achieved some great things. But it does not mean that we have come through to a socialist paradise. I don't think we ever will, alas. But we have seen great changes as a result of that. I think the environmental movement can tell us lots about sustainability, but it's proved very hard to make a large majority of people want to change their lives in a way that would help the planet avoid the need for the sort of things we're talking about.
Do you think there are lessons to be learned from recent endeavours by scientists and engineers involving technology? I'm particularly thinking about GM and nanotech, in terms of making the debate as even and as fair and as broad as possible.
Yeah.
And what are they?
Well, without wanting to, I think making the debate even and fair, and I think that's true from both sides. I mean, there's been in the GM debate, we've seen disinformation from people who are in favour of some forms of GM, and I think we've seen disinformation from people who are against some forms of GM. I think the problem is, if we don't, going back to the language of emotion, the way to think well about geoengineering, and I'm willing to accept that at the moment thinking well about geoengineering is saying we can't do this at the moment, so we shouldn't. But that's not the same as not thinking about it. And it's this kind of choice restriction that I find very distressing, because maybe pragmatically, if choice restriction was really working, I might be able to suck it up and say okay. But I don't see any evidence that it is working. And so I think a broader discourse about how you best serve your fellow human beings and the natural environment, just needs to have this broader perspective. And I quite agree. I mean, slightly back to Helen's point, I would certainly want to have the broader discussion out ahead of and around the scientific discussion. I don't want this to be a discussion led entirely by scientists.
So we have time for some questions from the floor.
So is geoengineering regarded as a permanent or a temporary solution? Because maybe there's an underlying risk of dependency on technology and manipulation of the Earth via this tool, or is it clear until when will geoengineering be used?
I think that's a very good question. I think most people thinking about climate geoengineering would like to think that you might use it temporarily to deal with what one might see as an overshoot in carbon dioxide. And I think that's quite possible. But temporarily, we are talking about shifts that, as Peter was saying, have lifetimes of millennia. So I don't think you would think that geoengineering would ever be something that you'd do for a few years and then forget about unless something very terrible happened. I mean, again, I'd take the example, I think, and it's not just a debating point, I do think that what human beings have done to the nitrogen cycle is sort of a form of geoengineering by changing the way a basic biogeochemical cycle on the planet works. And at the moment, there is no clear way that it would be possible to feed the people on the planet if we didn't do all that, do a good part of that nitrogen fixing. And so I think to some extent, some forms of geoengineering, if we accept that, might be here to stay. There may be aspects of how the world works that people want to say, well, okay, we're going to take that on for the long term. I don't think that's necessarily the case in climate. I wouldn't rule it out.
What political systems do you think should be put in place to govern this? And do you think that if politicians knew that geoengineering could solve their problems, would that just lead to greater apathy, and would the need for CO2 reduction, do you think that would take place?
I think there's a genuine, I think that what Matt referred to as the moral hazard is a genuine part of this discussion. I think that if people honestly believe that geoengineering can solve significant problems, that means that they will be less likely to pursue other ways of doing so. That means that it would be a good idea if they had those beliefs, that those beliefs should be right, and the best way to make them right is to have them widely critically tested. So I think that there's, I think the issue is a real one, that people might do less of other things if they believe geoengineering could work. But I don't think that's necessarily a reason for not trying to find out whether geoengineering can work. And I must say I'm at odds with quite a lot of the scientific community, including the magnificent Lord Rees on this. I think it's very dangerous to think about geoengineering purely in terms of something to keep in your back pocket as plan B, because that way you get the harm of what you were discussing there. You get the idea that people won't pursue other things because they'll think, oh, we've got this insurance policy. You'll be putting all the risk that Matt talked about so strongly of geoengineering onto future generations. So you'll be adding to their risks, but not giving them any benefit. That seems to me to be fundamentally wrong. So I do think that serious talk about geoengineering has to be talk about geoengineering that one might do without a specific emergency, that one might think about doing on an ongoing basis. I think it's quite important not to allow natural scientists to say, we really like researching this, we don't want to think about it, so we'll just say, if there's a huge disaster, then we'll use it. I don't think that's the right way to think about it. I think it needs to be integrated more deeply into how people think about the climate.
Well, thank you very much, Ollie.
Well, thanks very much. It's good to be here, and it's also good to agree very much with Ollie that CO2 is a great narrowing down of the issues that we face, and that we have many interactive problems, and as human beings we're very capable of seeing across a very wide spectrum of issues and linking things up together that we don't necessarily currently think should be linked. So that I remember talking to somebody about how scientists should be accompanied by people from other disciplines working interactively with them. I think that there's a very keen way in which we also ought to take on some of the perspectives of say, indigenous people who have not been consulted about geoengineering. I worked on the Biological Diversity Convention and asked for some of their people to be consulted on this. I think that there are insights from other cultures, other human cultures, that might be very helpful to us, other points of view. So I do think we need to broaden this discussion greatly and not keep it in this terrible sort of threatening, you can't really do anything about it. And you better leave it to us to do something about it, and so you better just carry on, or just pretend that nothing is happening. I think we could have a much richer and wider discussion, much more inclusive discussion than that. And certainly, we know much more about the risks of geoengineering, I'm glad to see now. And so we know that climate is a big threat, and we know that geoengineering is also carrying a major threat. And one of the issues that I would like to mention is that I think that geoengineering does add on to the issues and the difficulties, because we are dealing with dynamic systems here. We're dealing with a dynamic climate system. We know how dynamic it is, that it interacts with biological diversity. It also interacts with solar cycles, and so many other different kinds of cycle as well. We have to realize that we really don't understand very much. Our models are extraordinarily inadequate and clumsy and linear still, and so we need to be looking much more widely again and understanding something about the kind of uncertainties that we face here. And we don't want to compound those uncertainties unnecessarily. I think also we need a different kind of research. We need much more research into systems, into Earth systems, and if we're going to do anything about our situation. But we do have a major problem with moral hazard. I think there are a number of aspects to this. I think people don't feel included. I've been to some of the climate convention discussions, and I've seen governments taking positions. But then what do people have in the way of influence over this position taking and this blame game that goes on all the time? And it diverts, it obviously, we run the risk of having our attention diverted from what's really important by talking about pricing the environment and trying to find an economic answer, and looking at possible remedies like BECCS, which was mentioned, bioenergy, carbon capture and storage, which one person said is not geoengineering, but it's certainly being proposed as a way of addressing some of these issues, or solar radiation management. So we do have a major issue around moral hazard. And one of the things that used to strike me at the climate talks was, why didn't the developed countries have more to say about making commitments to change, to real change? I think real change would be possible if we allowed ourselves to think about it, but it seems as though our economics and our way of looking at the world makes it very difficult for us to even contemplate change. But perhaps it's not so difficult as we think it is, and maybe we should think in those terms. We should try and renew our thought and our discourse rather than getting stuck in this in certain ways of thinking about it. One of the things that I feel very worried about is technology. Our faith in technology is really touching, whether it's our mobile phones or whatever else it might be. And there is a real danger that we want to turn to technology as a way of addressing politically difficult and complex issues. And I really do think that this is a very visible problem for us. And there's a pattern to it. So we are promised solutions. We're drawn down a particular road of discourse, of examination, of scientific research, and we don't look at other areas of work. And I think we've seen this pattern repeated many times. I was very interested to hear mention of the nitrogen fertilizer issue, which is a very key matter. And there are a number of causes, a number of issues around how all this came about. But I must say that I would say that our dependency on, our population's dependency on nitrogen fertilizers is something that we have created through the fertilizers. And so we have to think about that, and not so much say it the other way around, that now we have a very large population, so we have to continue to use nitrogen fertilizers. There may be other ways. There are other ways, I think. But we're told that the situation is now so desperate that we have to act, and this is another way of turning the thumb screws on us all. And this is, I think it's very difficult for people to listen to the sort of desperateness of the situation too much without having a sense that they could become involved and they could make a contribution to changes. So we know that there's too much that's uncertain. I think that's definitely what I feel. There's too much that's uncertain to risk most of these so-called solutions. And what about the millions of people who are not included in this debate? People from South America, people from Africa, people from Asia. They feel that the countries that impose the problem on them, although that's increasingly shifting, I know, are now proposing a solution from the same mindset as before. And I think we should learn from that. I think we should try to find solutions from other sorts of mindset. And obviously geoengineering is quite likely to increase social injustice. And this is something that hasn't been mentioned so far, but social turbulence, injustice, and a sense of rage at having certain things done to you. For example, if the monsoon was to fail, if we were to save the Arctic sea ice, if we were, if this was how it was to work, and the monsoon was to fail, just imagine what the people there would feel, what they would do, and how much divisions would sow. So the social aspects of this are hugely important. And I can't help thinking that the impacts of climate change as a social problem might be less than the impacts of people trying to do geoengineering. And I'm not even going to try and address the fact that people might do it unilaterally. The point is that I think that there are things that we could do that would address a diversity of critical issues, and we have to forget the fact, perhaps, that it feels as though it's impossible that we could do things. We could change our agriculture. There are many things that we could do for our ecosystems to restore them, not using carbon dioxide removal specifically, but doing reforestation of native species and really looking at local projects for local areas. This is hugely difficult perhaps to organise, but we have to find societal ways of doing that, not to be oppressed by a problem and a system which we're going to have to change. We are going to have to radically change it in order to carry this out. So that's the challenge. Thank you.
Peter Oliver, do you have any questions to pose?
Peter? No. Well, I agree with a lot of what you said. But again, I suppose as the comments that you're making towards the end on nitrogen fertilisers is it's important because it's one of many factors which define the difficulty of supporting the Earth's population. So, in a sense, there is a panic, and you say we shouldn't panic. We should change to a more sustainable way of life. But many people would say there simply isn't time, that the world population has increased so much with industrialised agriculture that we have to go on with industrialised agriculture, otherwise we'll have massive starvation. And this is dangerous because nitrogen fertilisers are a case, but another case that was pointed out to me recently was phosphorus, that fertilisers have to be also made from phosphorus, and phosphorus is running out as a resource in the world. It'll probably run out before, because nitrogen can be synthesised, but phosphorus can't. So there's a phosphorus crisis, which was pointed out by Paul Crutzen. And so how do we, it boils down in the end, I think, still that we should be really worried about immediate effects that threaten our existing population, and which is why we need to think about these rather unpleasant things like geoengineering.
Well, there are figures that say that we're already producing 4,000 calories per head of population, which is more than people need. We waste extraordinary amounts of food. We feed far too much of that food to animals. 30% of our arable land goes to producing animal feed. There are changes we could make. We have to ask ourselves, is it inevitable that we must continue with industrial agriculture because that's what we've been doing? Or can we try to consciously make a change? What a huge demand that is. But if we continue with industrial agriculture, I can't help feeling that we'll get ourselves further into the same hole. So we have to make a choice there.
I can feel myself wanting to go down the road of industrial agriculture, but I wanted to come back to something else. I can entirely applaud your aims, but do you not feel that the lack of political traction you have for these things makes collective action really quite hard? Because it remains the case that there's been a strong green movement in the world for now about 40 years. And in terms of some policies, it's been extraordinarily successful. But in terms of reducing the overall energy intensity of consumption in Western countries, it's not done a great deal. And most of the improvements in living standards in developing countries have come about through energy intensification, which is hard to manage. And so it seems to me that people are relentlessly choosing not to be as you wish them to be. And isn't that something of a problem for your programme?
I agree, it is a problem. And that's why I say, being at the climate convention discussions back in 2008 to 9, I was thinking what would happen if different commitments were made. I totally take your point. You can either say, well, we have to go down this road because people are not going to change and nothing is really going to alter, so we have to take this preventive action. But in a sense, we could say that we have an extraordinary and rather terrifying opportunity to really try and make a change. And I don't know how we can do. I mean, collective action is very difficult. If you ask an indigenous community in Colombia how long it takes them to make a decision that includes everybody, well, it takes a while. But we seem to have some choices here, philosophical, actual, and so forth. And maybe we have to think about things that we might think are almost impossible, but maybe they're worth trying.
This debate, as most debates are, has been focused very much on people and our survival and how we will cope. But very little has been paid to the actual environment. At present, we are having the biggest biodiversity crisis in the history of the world. The extinction rate of species is over 1,000 times the natural rate, and humanity is causing the biggest natural extinction event in history. This is largely attributed to how fast temperatures are changing. My question is, if temperatures are brought down just as fast, it does not bring the globe back to where it was pre-industrial revolution. There is no proof of this. So, it has the potential to devastatingly affect species. Can our morals actually support this? Because at the rate of extinction, it can't.
I agree with you that the rate of extinction is incredibly worrying and tragic. I don't know if climate change is responsible for most of it. I would have imagined that actually human intervention in all sorts of ways is responsible for most of it, and we're destroying species that we haven't even seen. We don't even know that we've seen them yet. We certainly haven't described them. And that is possibly an even greater crisis in many ways, because that undermines what we depend upon. We depend upon diversity of species that we know, species that we don't know. Take the Brazil nut tree and the bee that fertilizes the flowers, whose male has to bathe in an orchid flower in order to attract the female. Now, what complexity is there that we hardly understand? A marvelous story, but how many other lines of complexity are there? I would totally agree with you, and I think that's why we have to somehow expand ourselves so as to be able to look beyond our own human horizons. I mean, that's another challenge that we have. And I think that we have to look at what the challenges are and what we kind of need to do, rather than taking a slightly mechanistic or economical point of view on it. That's all I can say.
To date, the conversation has
Sorry.
consistently said that no one wants to use geoengineering, and the slippery slope argument is being put forward. But let me put forward a scenario to you, based upon what I believe is the case, that the engineering has not yet been done for any of these geoengineering projects. In other words, it probably would take 20 or 30 years to bring the information to the fore where in fact it can be done. So let me ask you how you would feel in 30 years' time if you had the tides rise and all of Bangladesh was wiped out and there was absolutely nothing you could do because you haven't done the preliminary work.
This I find a familiar argument, and I can see that it could be one that would be going to make me feel very bad if I was to stop, I mean just talking from a personal point of view, stop looking at seawater rise in Bangladesh. But the point is, how are we going to agree to do these things, and in what way? I mean, you're treating the people of Bangladesh as though they were, when you say that, it's almost like a sort of objectification. It's hard to, certainly we should, yes, okay, so that, absolutely, and the people in the Maldives at the climate talks always say we're sinking under the water as well. And they laugh at the idea of the insurance companies who come along because it's ludicrous to suggest that they might be insurable. I agree that we should be looking at how to solve these problems. I'm just worried about us looking with a particular lens at it, and that it kind of disempowers people. And that's the question that I'm asking. I'm asking because individuals and governments can make decisions and decide that this is the right way to go forward and we'll do this. Sorry?
You're stopping the research.
Stopping the research. I'm not stopping the research on Earth systems and how to look at it. I'm just trying to challenge this idea that there is a sort of mechanical way of dealing with this that we can guarantee in some way, because I'm uncertain that this is the case.
Well, thank you very much, Helena. I think that the issues are complex and multifaceted. I'm running a course this week which actually has a slightly different title. It's called Can We Engineer the Climate? And my students are all sitting over there. And it's a bit scary. If you start from the supposition that can you do it, it's a different question to whether we ought to do it or whether we should think about doing it. And I'm very pleased the speakers tonight have addressed the issue of whether we should think about engineering the climate. And I should then close by asking you the question whether we should think about engineering the climate. How many of you are on the fence and undecided? How many of you think that we should think about engineering the climate? And how many of you think we ought not to think about engineering the climate? Well, there we go. That's how we've managed to move our audience this evening. I'd like you, in the warmest possible fashion, to thank our speakers tonight.